That pile of plastic and metal you call a greenhouse. Karen Miller, the self-appointed queen of Serenity Meadows, sneered, her voice carrying across my newly laid gravel driveway with the force of a dull saw cutting through oak. Will be torn down by the end of the month, Mr. Thorne, or I will have it torn down for you, and you will be billed for every glorious, rule-enforcing second of it. The clipboard in her hand was less a tool for notes and more a scepter of suburban authority, and she brandished it towards the gleaming structure that represented the culmination of my life's second act. Behind me, the state-of-the-art, 3,000 square foot greenhouse stood, not as a pile of plastic, but as a monument to engineering and botany, its polycarbonate panels reflecting the morning sun in a way that seemed to personally offend her. I could feel the heat of humiliation creeping up my neck, not from her words, but from the fact that my neighbors were now peeking through their blinds, drawn to the spectacle of a plus-size woman in a pastel pink tracksuit attempting to verbally dismantle a retired Army Corps of Engineers major on his own property. She had no idea what she had just stepped into. She saw a hobbyist's overreach. She was blind to the agricultural lynchpin of the entire county she was threatening to demolish. This is going to be a wild ride, and I promise you, the payoff is worth every second. Before we dive into the weeds, literally and figuratively, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever had your own run-in with a power-tripping HOA president, share your nightmare story. I read all of them. Now back to Karen and her declaration of war. To understand the sheer audacity of her demand, you have to understand my property. After 25 years of designing and overseeing the construction of everything from forward operating bases in Afghanistan to flood levees on the Mississippi, I retired. My wife, Sarah, and I wanted one thing: space. Not just a big yard, but acreage. We found a 5-acre plot on the very edge of the Serenity Meadows development. Crucially, it was an original parcel of land that had been grandfathered in before the bulk of the subdivision was built. And when the developer went belly up, the HOA had absorbed the zoning oversight in a messy, poorly documented transfer of power. I did my due diligence, or so I thought. I read the covenants, a document thicker than a phone book and twice as boring. But my military training taught me to read the fine print. The land was zoned for residential and limited agricultural use, a vague but beautiful phrase that was the legal bedrock of my entire plan. For a year, I worked the land. I built our house, a simple, sturdy craftsman-style home set far back from the road. And then I began construction on the greenhouse. It wasn't a weekend project from a big box store. This was a commercial-grade, climate-controlled facility designed to my exact specifications. It had a galvanized steel frame rated for hurricane-force winds, double-walled polycarbonate panels for insulation, a heated concrete slab floor with integrated drainage, and a computer-controlled system for managing temperature, humidity, and irrigation. This was my new mission: to cultivate and propagate rare and exotic plants, specifically Phalaenopsis and Cattleya orchids, along with a few dozen varieties of heirloom tomatoes that were notoriously difficult to grow. It was a business, Thorne and Bloom, and I already had verbal agreements to be the sole specialty supplier for every single garden center and high-end nursery within a 50-mile radius, including the 3 largest ones right in the town of Oak Hollow, which Serenity Meadows called its home. The greenhouse was the heart of that business, the engine of my retirement, and Karen, in her infinite wisdom, had just ordered me to rip its heart out. I simply stood there for a moment, letting her words hang in the air like toxic pollen. I gave her a slow, deliberate nod. "I've received your message, Mrs. Miller," I said, my voice perfectly level. "You can expect a formal response." Her face, already florid, seemed to inflate with indignation. She expected me to argue, to plead, to fold. She didn't know that I don't argue with threats. I document them. As she turned and stomped back toward her golf cart, the unofficial royal chariot of the HOA, I pulled out my phone and took a clear, time-stamped photo of her and her vehicle next to my mailbox. The first piece of evidence. The war had begun, not with a bang, but with the click of a smartphone camera and the quiet hum of my greenhouse's circulation fans. She thought the rules were her weapon. She was about to find out that I was the one who wrote the book on regulations, and I was more than happy to teach her how to read it. The first lesson was about to be expensive. The official notice arrived 3 days later, delivered by certified mail, a classic intimidation tactic designed to make the recipient feel like they're already halfway to court. The envelope was thick with the kind of high-quality paper stock that screamed, "We have money for lawyers." Inside, nestled amongst several pages of boilerplate legal threats, citing various obscure bylaws, was the core of Karen's argument. Violation of Article 9, Section 4. No temporary structures, including but not limited to sheds, tents, or unapproved outbuildings, shall be erected on any lot without prior written consent from the Architectural Review Committee. My greenhouse, my $500,000, permanent, state-of-the-art agricultural facility, was being classified as a temporary structure on par with a pop-up canopy for a backyard barbecue. The sheer blissful ignorance of it was almost breathtaking. The letter demanded immediate cessation of all unauthorized commercial activity and the complete removal of the unapproved structure within 30 days. Failure to comply would result in a fine of $200 per day, retroactive to the date of the letter, plus any legal fees incurred by the HOA in their enforcement action. I spread the documents across the massive oak table in my home office, the same table where I'd planned logistical support for entire brigades. Sarah stood behind me, her hand on my shoulder, her worry a tangible presence in the room. "Marcus, this is insane," she said softly. "Can they actually do this?" I tapped the offending clause with my finger. "They can try," I replied, my voice calm. "But they've made a critical error. They've misclassified the asset." This was military speak, a habit I hadn't shaken. To me, this wasn't a personal attack. It was a flawed tactical assessment on the enemy's part. I spent the next 2 days not in a panic, but in my element. Research. I pulled up the original property survey, the county zoning ordinances, and the HOA's own formation documents that I had saved digitally when we bought the land. I cross-referenced everything. The HOA covenants were, as I suspected, a mess. They were a Frankenstein's monster of boilerplate templates with sections that contradicted each other and definitions that were dangerously vague. But the county regulations were crystal clear. My property, due to its size and original platting, was not just zoned for limited agriculture. It fell under a specific subcategory that explicitly permitted the construction of buildings for the purpose of horticulture, floriculture, and viticulture. The county defined an outbuilding as a structure ancillary to a primary residence, like a small shed or garage. My greenhouse, being a primary structure for a registered business, didn't fit that definition. It was an agricultural building governed not by the HOA's petty aesthetic rules, but by county and state agricultural codes, all of which I had meticulously followed and had the permits to prove. Karen's weapon, Article 9, Section 4, was a water pistol aimed at a battleship. The final piece of the puzzle was the Architectural Review Committee, or ARC. The letter stated they hadn't given prior written consent. I dug into the HOA's public records, which were available online if you knew where to look. The ARC was supposed to have 3 members. For the last 2 years, it had only one, Karen Miller. The other 2 positions were vacant. She was the judge, jury, and executioner, a committee of 1. This was better than I could have hoped for. It was a procedural flaw so glaring it bordered on malfeasance. With all my research compiled, printed, and organized into a neat tabbed binder, I began to compose my response. It wasn't a letter. It was a legal dissertation. I opened by acknowledging receipt of their letter, citing the certified mail tracking number. Then I systematically dismantled their entire case. I quoted the county zoning ordinance, highlighting the section on permitted agricultural structures. I provided a copy of my building permit, signed and stamped by the county inspector. I defined, using the county's own legal dictionary, the difference between an outbuilding and an agricultural facility. I then addressed the ARC. I pointed out that a committee of 1 is not a committee, and that any decision made by this improperly constituted body was legally void. I attached the public record showing the vacant positions. I concluded the letter by politely rejecting their demands in their entirety. I stated that the greenhouse was a legal, permitted structure essential to my registered business, Thorne and Bloom, LLC. I informed them that the daily fines were illegitimate and would not be paid. And then I added a little stinger of my own, a preview of the strategy to come. I stated that any attempt to interfere with the structure or my business operations, including the levying of baseless fines or the placement of a lien on my property, would be met with a lawsuit for tortious interference, seeking damages for any and all lost income. I had my lawyer, a sharp-as-a-tack former JAG officer I'd served with, give it a once-over. He just grinned. It's polite, professional, and it puts the ball squarely back in their court to do something stupid, or he said, send it. I sent it via certified mail, of course, with a return receipt requested. I also sent a courtesy copy via email to the HOA's general inbox, creating a digital paper trail. The ball was in her court, and knowing Karen, I was confident she would try to smash it right back over the net, completely unaware that the net was now electrified. The waiting was the easiest part. I had a greenhouse to run. Karen's response to my meticulously crafted legal rebuttal was, predictably, to double down. She didn't address a single point I had made. She didn't acknowledge the county codes, the permits, or the fact that her architectural review committee was a sham. Instead, about a week later, a new letter arrived. This one was shorter, sharper, and dripping with condescension. It stated that their legal counsel had reviewed my letter and found it without merit. It informed me that the HOA's authority superseded county zoning in matters of community aesthetics and covenants, a claim that was legally dubious at best. The fines, it declared, were not only still in effect but were now being compounded daily. The bill, attached on a separate sheet, had climbed to an audacious $4,200. It was like arguing with a brick wall, if the brick wall could send you invoices. But I noticed something else. The letters started appearing not just in my mailbox, but stuck directly to my front door, held by a piece of tape. This was a deliberate act of intimidation, a way of saying, we were here on your porch. I installed a new security camera, a discreet one tucked into the eaves above the door. It didn't take long to pay for itself. 2 days later, the camera captured crystal clear footage of Karen's golf cart pulling into my driveway just after dawn. She waddled up to the door, a smug look on her face, and slapped another envelope onto the wood. Then she took a slow, deliberate walk around the side of my house, peering over the fence towards the greenhouse, even standing on her tiptoes to try and get a better look inside. She was snooping, trespassing, and I had it all on high-definition video, time-stamped and saved to a secure cloud server. This was no longer just a legal dispute, it was harassment. The fines kept coming. Every few days, another envelope, another bill. $5,600, $7,000. The numbers were becoming absurd, monopoly money wielded as a weapon. I never acknowledged them. I simply filed them away in a binder labeled Exhibit B. Sarah was finding it harder to remain calm. Marcus, this is getting out of hand, she said one evening, holding the latest bill. The total was now over $10,000. They can't be serious. They are, I said, not looking up from the laptop where I was monitoring the delicate pH balance of the nutrient solution for my orchids. But being serious and being right are two different things. Let her build her paper mountain, Sarah. Every single one of these is another nail in her coffin. My strategy wasn't to fight her on her terms. It was to let her build a case so outrageously flawed, so full of procedural errors and personal vindictiveness, that it would collapse under its own weight when presented to an actual, impartial authority. I continued my work. The greenhouse was thriving. The first crop of heirloom black crim tomatoes were ripening on the vine, their deep, dusky color a thing of beauty. My orchids were budding, tiny green shoots promising a spectacular bloom. I had contracts to fulfill. The owner of the Gilded Trowel, the most exclusive nursery in the county, had already prepaid for a significant order of Cattleya hybrids, and the deadline was approaching. The pressure was on, but it was a pressure I understood. It was about logistics, growth cycles, and delivery schedules. Karen's war was a distraction, an annoying hum in the background of my real work. But the hum was getting louder. She escalated from paper to people. I'd be out mowing my 5 acres on my compact tractor, and I'd see her golf cart parked at the edge of my property line, just watching. Sometimes another board member would be with her, a thin, nervous-looking man named Gerald. They'd point and talk, their body language a clear pantomime of disapproval. They were trying to create a public spectacle, to paint me as the problem neighbor. It wasn't working. Most of my neighbors were too far away to care, and the ones closest to me were more curious than concerned. One of them, a retired school teacher named Eleanor, stopped me by the mailbox one afternoon. "Is it true you're growing prize-winning orchids in there?" she asked, her eyes twinkling as she gestured toward the greenhouse. I smiled. "I'm trying, Eleanor. It's a bit of a passion project. Karen's telling everyone you're running a factory and that it's lowering property values," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I told her that a man who keeps his lawn as neat as you do is hardly a blight on the neighborhood. Besides, I think it's wonderful." That was the first crack in Karen's armor. She assumed the entire community was her personal army. She failed to account for the fact that most people just want to be left alone, and they resent a bully. I had my research, I had my video evidence, and now I had the first inkling of a community that was not entirely on her side. The paper mountain was growing, the video files were accumulating, and Karen, blinded by her own power, was marching deeper and deeper into the trap I was patiently allowing her to build for herself. Karen's next move was to poison the well. Since her direct attacks and paper-based warfare were having no effect on my resolve, she shifted her strategy to social ostracism and rumor-mongering. At the community mail kiosk, she would hold court, speaking in a voice just loud enough to be overheard about the illegal commercial operation being run by the new guy on Lot 1. She painted me as a greedy developer in disguise, someone who used a loophole to get into their quiet enclave, only to build a noisy, light-polluting factory that would surely tank everyone's property values. The irony was rich, considering my greenhouse was silent save for the gentle whir of fans, and its lighting was downward cast and baffled to prevent light spill, a detail I'd meticulously designed. But facts were irrelevant in Karen's campaign. Feeling was everything, and she was an expert at manufacturing a sense of communal threat. I learned about most of this from Eleanor, my friendly neighbor, who provided me with regular intelligence briefings during our chats by the road. "She told Brenda next door that your trucks would be coming and going at all hours," Eleanor reported one day, shaking her head in disbelief. "I haven't seen a single truck, Marcus, other than the one you drive." "The plants are delivered in my van, Eleanor," I explained. "Once a week. It's quieter than her golf cart." This was the nature of her attack. Death by 1,000 cuts, all of them imagined. She was trying to turn me into a phantom menace. But her campaign had an unintended side effect. In trying to isolate me, she overplayed her hand with others. Her reign of terror wasn't limited to my greenhouse. As I started having quiet conversations with other neighbors, a pattern emerged. There was Bob, a fellow veteran from the Air Force, who had been fined $50 a week for 3 months because his basketball hoop was, according to Karen, not a pre-approved model, despite it having been there for 5 years before she was even elected president. There was the Henderson family who were ordered to rip out a beautiful, mature Japanese maple because it wasn't on the HOA's list of approved trees. They were heartbroken. Each story was a miniature version of my own, a petty, arbitrary rule, an outsized punishment, and a president who wielded the covenant book like a holy text, interpreting it to fit her every whim. Karen wasn't just attacking me. She was suffocating the entire community with bureaucratic kutsu. This was the opening I needed. I wasn't just fighting for my greenhouse anymore. I was fighting for Bob's basketball hoop and the Hendersons' maple tree. I started documenting their stories, asking for copies of their violation notices and fines. I advised them not to pay, to simply file the notices away, and to send a polite, registered letter back to the HOA asking for the specific, unambiguous bylaw they had violated. I was teaching them my methods, building a small, quiet insurgency. My most important alliance, however, was forged not in the neighborhood, but in town. It was time to shore up my business flank. I loaded up my van with a few sample orchid blooms and some of the first ripe heirloom tomatoes and drove to the Gilded Trowel. The owner, a sharp woman in her 60s named Martha, greeted me warmly. Marcus, I was just about to call you. These pictures you sent don't do them justice, she said, marveling at the deep, velvety purple of a black Prince tomato. We walked through her immaculate nursery, a place that was part garden, part art gallery. The pre-orders for your orchids are through the roof, she said. The garden clubs are all buzzing. I took a deep breath. Martha, I need to talk to you about a potential supply chain issue. I laid out the situation with the HOA in calm, measured tones. I didn't editorialize or complain. I presented it as a logistical problem. The president of the association is demanding I demolish my primary production facility. Martha's friendly demeanor evaporated, replaced by a flinty-eyed seriousness. She was a businesswoman, and I was talking about a threat to her bottom line. She's what? She asked, her voice dangerously quiet. She wants to tear down the only local source for the products my customers are already lining up to buy? I nodded. She seems to believe it's a temporary shed. Martha let out a short, sharp laugh, devoid of humor. That woman is a menace, Karen Miller. She comes in here every spring and argues about the price of petunias. And her husband, David, he's some kind of financial planner, right? He's been trying to get into the Oak Hollow Business Association for a year, wants to network with the movers and shakers. A new critical piece of information, a new front in the war. The Business Association, I repeated slowly, letting the idea take root. Who is on the board of that association, Martha? She smiled, a slow, predatory smile that reminded me of a hawk spotting a field mouse. Well, for starters, I am. So is Frank from Frank's Fine Flowers and George from the County Gardener. Frank and George were the owners of the other two largest nurseries in the county. They were also my clients. Martha, I said, my own smile forming, I believe it's time we scheduled a meeting with the Oak Hollow Business Association. I have a presentation I think they'll find very interesting. The battlefield was expanding. Karen thought she was fighting a single homeowner on a quiet cul-de-sac. She had no idea she was about to pick a fight with the entire horticultural economy of Oak Hollow County. The letter I'd been waiting for arrived on a Tuesday. It was from a law firm I didn't recognize, Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe, a name so cliché it had to be real. This was the escalation I had anticipated, the moment Karen decided to stop playing with paper and start playing with fire. The letter was thick, imposing, and full of legalese designed to terrify the average person into submission. It formally notified me that the Serenity Meadows Homeowners Association was placing a lien on my property for the amount of the unpaid fines, which had now ballooned to a comical $17,800. Furthermore, it stated that if the structure was not removed within 15 days, they would file a suit in civil court to force its removal and to foreclose on the lien. This was her checkmate move, or so she thought. A lien could complicate my life immensely, affecting my credit and my ability to sell the property. Foreclosure was the nuclear option. She was trying to take my home. I read the letter twice, a cold, calm anger solidifying in my gut. This was no longer about a greenhouse. This was about principle. I immediately forwarded a scanned copy to Alex, my lawyer. His call came less than 10 minutes later. It's beautiful, Marcus, he said, and I could hear the grin in his voice. It's a procedurally flawed, legally unsupported, bad faith action. They've just handed us the keys to the kingdom. Explain, I said, pulling out a fresh legal pad. First, Alex began, his voice shifting into lecture mode. They can't just place a lien. In this state, for an HOA to place a lien for fines, not for unpaid dues but for fines, they have to follow a strict process. That includes providing an opportunity for a formal hearing before the board, a hearing they never offered you. Strike one. I made a note. No hearing offered. Second, the basis for the fines is the violation, which we've already established is based on a misinterpretation of their own covenants and a complete disregard for county law. A judge will laugh at the idea of your permanent, permitted agricultural building being a temporary structure. The lien has no legal foundation. Strike two. I wrote down no legal foundation. And third, and this is the home run, Marcus. Alex's voice was electric with excitement. This action, this formal threat to your property and your livelihood, is the final piece we need for our tortious interference claim. They are now actively and maliciously attempting to cause you financial harm. They've crossed the line from harassment to tangible, prosecutable damages. This isn't just a defense anymore. This is an attack. We spent the next hour on the phone, mapping out the counteroffensive. Alex would draft a blistering response to the HOA's lawyer. It would not only demand the immediate removal of the improperly filed lien, but would also put them on notice for our impending lawsuit. The suit would name the HOA as an entity and, crucially, Karen Miller personally, as president and as the sole, self-appointed member of the Architectural Review Committee. We would argue that she had acted outside the scope of her authority and with malicious intent. Piercing the corporate veil and going after her directly was the only way to truly make the lesson stick. While Alex worked on the legal paperwork, I had my own mission. It was time to consolidate my allies. I spent the afternoon driving, not in my work van, but in my clean, respectable sedan. My first stop was Bob's house, the Air Force vet with the illegal basketball hoop. I showed him the lien letter. His face hardened. He'd received a similar threat a year ago and had taken the hoop down out of fear. "That woman," he said, his voice tight with anger. "She runs this place like her own private fiefdom." I explained our counter-lawsuit, the tortious interference claim, and the focus on Karen's procedural abuses. "We need to show a pattern of behavior," I said. "It's not just about me. It's about everyone she's done this to." I handed him a blank affidavit form that Alex had drafted. "Just write down what happened, Bob. Dates, conversations, copies of the notices. The truth. That's all we need." He took the form without hesitation. "You'll have it by tomorrow." My next stop was the Henderson family. I found Mrs. Henderson quietly watering the empty patch of lawn where her beloved Japanese maple used to be. I told her the same story, showed her the same letter. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of frustration and helplessness. When I explained that we could hold Karen personally accountable, a spark of defiance returned to her face. She took the affidavit. "We have photos," she said, "of the tree, before and after." "Perfect," I said. I spent the rest of the day visiting 4 other families, each with their own story of Karen's tyranny. A forbidden garden gnome, a flagpole that was 2 inches too tall, a front door painted in a shade of blue deemed too vibrant. Each story was petty and absurd on its own, but together they formed a mosaic of abuse, a clear and undeniable pattern of a single person weaponizing HOA rules to bully and control her neighbors. As the sun began to set, I drove home, a stack of completed or promised affidavits on the seat beside me. Alex was preparing the legal broadside. I was assembling the citizens' army. The lien was Karen's biggest mistake. She thought she was cornering me. But all she had done was give me the moral high ground and the legal ammunition to escalate the conflict onto a battlefield of my own choosing. She had threatened my property. Now we were going to threaten her power, her reputation, and her personal finances. The game had changed. The trap was now fully baited, and all that was left was to spring it. The plan had 2 prongs, the legal assault and the public detonation. Alex fired the first shot. He sent our response to Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe. It was a masterpiece of controlled legal fury. The letter systematically dismantled their lien threat, citing the state statutes they had failed to follow regarding hearings. It demanded the immediate written withdrawal of the lien within 5 business days, stating that failure to do so would result in a suit for slander of title. But the real payload was in the second half of the letter. It formally put the HOA and Karen Miller, in her personal capacity, on notice for a forthcoming lawsuit. The causes of action were listed in cold, hard bullet points: tortious interference with business operations, breach of fiduciary duty, abuse of process, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We attached copies of the affidavits from Bob, the Hendersons, and the other families, labeling them as preliminary evidence of a pattern of harassment. We were showing them our hand, letting them know that this wasn't just about a greenhouse anymore. It was about a systematic abuse of power. The letter concluded by demanding the immediate cessation of all fines, a formal written apology to me and the other residents, and the immediate resignation of Karen Miller from the board. It was an audacious set of demands, designed not because we expected them to be met, but to frame the narrative and sow chaos within their ranks. We knew Karen would never resign willingly. We were counting on it. While the legal bomb was ticking, I prepared for the public explosion. I confirmed with Martha from the Gilded Trowel that the monthly meeting of the Oak Hollow Business Association was the following week. She had already spoken to Frank and George, the other nursery owners. They were furious. My greenhouse wasn't just a supplier, it was their competitive edge against the big box stores. They were all in. Martha had managed to get me a 10-minute slot on the agenda under the guise of a new local supplier discusses community partnership. It was perfect. The final piece of preparation was my dossier. I spent 2 nights compiling everything into a clear, damning presentation. I had a timeline of events starting with Karen's first verbal threat. I had high-quality prints of the photos I'd taken of her trespassing, contrasted with photos of my pristine, well-maintained property. I had a spreadsheet showing the escalating, baseless fines. I created a simple diagram illustrating the supply chain. A big picture of my greenhouse with arrows pointing to the logos of the Gilded Trowel, Frank's Fine Flowers, and the County Gardener. Underneath, I put a simple, powerful caption. Your entire specialty plant supply for 2023 depends on this one building. I also included a section on the community impact, summarizing the affidavits from my neighbors, showing that this was not an isolated incident. I printed 10 copies of the entire dossier, each one in a sleek, professional black binder. The targets were clear: the HOA's lawyer, the other members of the HOA board, who I suspected were largely ignorant of the extent of Karen's actions, and the key members of the Oak Hollow Business Association. I had a copy for Karen's husband, David, too. I wanted him to see, in black and white, how his wife's personal vendetta was about to torpedo his professional ambitions. The day before the business association meeting, Alex called. They're panicking, he said, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice. I got a call from their lawyer. He was conciliatory. He wanted to know if we could resolve this amicably. He knows the lien is garbage and that your affidavits give you massive leverage. He's trying to put out the fire before it burns the whole house down. What did you tell him? I asked. I told him our demands were non-negotiable, especially the resignation. I said we'd be happy to discuss a settlement after Mrs. Miller has stepped down. He tried to argue, but his heart wasn't in it. He knows he's defending an indefensible position. This was the key. We had isolated Karen from her own legal counsel. Her lawyer's job was to protect the HOA from liability, not to defend Karen's ego. By making her resignation a precondition, we were forcing the board to make a choice: Karen or the financial health of the association. The trap was now set. Karen believed she was on the verge of victory, with a lien filed and a foreclosure lawsuit imminent. She had no idea that her own lawyer was already looking for an exit strategy, that her neighbors had formally documented her abuse, and that the local business community was about to declare her a direct threat to their livelihood. She was walking into an ambush from 3 different directions. The business meeting was the designated kill zone, and I was bringing the ammunition. The annual HOA meeting was scheduled for the week after the business association meeting, a fact that played perfectly into my timeline. The public humiliation would come first, followed by the community reckoning. It was a 1-2 punch designed to leave Karen with no allies, no credibility, and no choice but to surrender. But first, the business association. The meeting was held in a rented conference room at the Oak Hollow Country Club, a place that reeked of old money and new ambition. I saw David Miller, Karen's husband, near the back, schmoozing with a few men in suits. He looked confident, pleased with himself, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to break over his head. I took my seat, placing my leather briefcase on the table in front of me. Inside were the 10 black binders. Martha, sitting at the head table as a board member, gave me a subtle, encouraging nod. The first part of the meeting was a blur of minutes, treasurer's reports, and announcements. Then the president of the association, a portly man who owned a chain of car dealerships, looked at his agenda. Next up, we have a presentation from Marcus Thorne, a new local supplier, on community partnership. I walked to the podium, my footsteps echoing slightly in the quiet room. I could feel David Miller's eyes on me, a flicker of recognition and confusion in them. He knew who I was. He couldn't possibly fathom why I was here. Good afternoon, I began, my voice calm and steady. My name is Marcus Thorne. I'm the owner of Thorne and Bloom, a specialized horticultural facility located here in Oak Hollow. Many of you already know my work, even if you don't know my name. I paused and looked directly at Martha, Frank, and George. My company is the sole supplier of high-demand orchids and specific heirloom vegetable cultivars to the Gilded Trowel, Frank's Fine Flowers, and the County Gardener. A murmur went through the room. I had their attention. My facility, I continued, is the culmination of a lifetime of planning and a significant capital investment. It is also, according to the president of my homeowners association, Karen Miller, an unapproved temporary structure that must be demolished. The murmur grew louder. I saw David Miller's smile falter. His back stiffened. For the past 3 months, I said, letting my voice fill with a cold anger, Mrs. Miller has waged a campaign of harassment against my legally permitted, county-approved business. This has included daily fines totaling nearly $20,000, trespassing on my property, and, as of last week, the filing of an illegal lien against my home and a threat of foreclosure. I let that sink in. The room was silent. This is not just an attack on my family and my property. It is a direct threat to the businesses of at least 3 members of this very association. If Mrs. Miller is successful, the supply of some of the most profitable and in-demand plants in this county will vanish overnight. I opened my briefcase and pulled out the black binders. I have prepared a dossier for your review. I walked over and handed one directly to Martha. I gave another to the association president. Then I walked to the back of the room and placed a binder on the table directly in front of a pale, frozen David Miller. It contains the full timeline, copies of the violation notices, photos of the harassment, and a legal analysis from my attorney outlining the bad faith actions taken by Mrs. Miller. It also details how these actions threaten to disrupt a significant portion of the local horticultural market. I returned to the podium. I'm not here today to ask for your help in my legal fight. That is already well underway. I am here to inform you, as a matter of professional courtesy, that a key part of your local supply chain is under deliberate and malicious attack from within our own community. The person leading that attack is the wife of a man who seeks to join your ranks. Every eye in the room swiveled to David Miller. He looked like he'd been struck by lightning. He opened the binder, his hands trembling slightly, and saw the pictures of his wife snooping, the absurd invoices, the legal threats. The color drained from his face. Martha stood up. As a board member and as one of the business owners directly affected, I find this information deeply disturbing, she announced, her voice ringing with authority. The stability of our local economy depends on mutual support, not sabotage. I think we need to seriously reconsider Mr. Miller's membership application in light of this hostile activity. The association president, looking at the binder in his hands, nodded grimly. I agree. This is not how we do business in Oak Hollow. The trap had been sprung. David Miller's ambition was in ashes. He was socially and professionally radioactive. He wouldn't be making any powerful friends today. He slowly closed the binder, stood up without a word, and walked out of the room, his face a mask of humiliation and fury. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't made a scene. I had simply presented the facts, calmly and professionally. And in doing so, I had turned Karen's greatest weapon, her social standing, into her greatest liability. The war wasn't over, but a decisive battle had just been won. The fallout from the business association meeting was swift and brutal. I learned from Martha that David Miller had not only been blackballed from the association, but that word of his wife's anti-business crusade had spread like wildfire through the town's influential circles. David, whose financial planning business relied heavily on networking and reputation, was facing a professional catastrophe of his wife's making. The pressure on Karen was now coming from all sides. From her own HOA lawyer, who was desperately trying to avoid a lawsuit, from her humiliated and furious husband, and soon from the community she claimed to lead. The stage was set for the annual HOA meeting. It was held in the clubhouse, a sterile beige room that Karen had decorated with an alarming number of silk plants. She sat at the head of a long table, flanked by the other 4 board members, who all looked deeply uncomfortable. The treasurer, Gerald, the same nervous man I'd seen with Karen on her surveillance missions, was visibly sweating. The room was packed. Word had spread. This wasn't going to be a typical sleepy meeting about lawn maintenance and pool hours. This was a showdown. Bob, the Hendersons, and the other families I had spoken to were all there, sitting together in a block, a silent, unified front. The first half of the meeting was standard procedure. Karen, attempting to project an aura of complete control, moved through the agenda with forced cheerfulness. She presented the budget, talked about a new plan for holiday decorations, and then she made her fatal mistake. She opened the floor for new business. I stood up. A hush fell over the room. Karen's face tightened, her eyes narrowing into slits. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice dripping with venom, "I assume you have something to say about your unapproved project." "I do," I replied, my voice carrying to every corner of the room. "But first, I have a question for the treasurer. Gerald, could you please confirm for the residents the total amount of legal fees the HOA has incurred over the past 3 months in its dispute with me?" Gerald flinched as if he'd been slapped. He stammered, looking helplessly at Karen, who shot him a look that could curdle milk. I, uh, I don't have that exact figure in front of me." "Allow me to help you," I said, pulling a piece of paper from my jacket pocket. It was a copy of the invoice from Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe, which Alex had obtained through legal discovery. "The total is $12,450, billed to the HOA. Billed to all of you," I said, turning to address the other homeowners. $12,000 of your dues spent trying to tear down a legally permitted building based on the personal whim of one person." A wave of angry murmurs swept through the audience. "And that doesn't include the lawsuit the HOA is now facing," I continued, letting the words land like hammer blows. "A lawsuit for tortious interference, abuse of process, and harassment. A lawsuit that names not only the HOA, but Mrs. Miller personally." I turned my gaze back to the board. "I'd also like to ask the board if they ever held a formal vote to authorize the lien that was placed on my property." The board members looked at each other in confusion. It was clear they had no idea. "Did you know," I pressed on, "that a lien was filed in your name, putting this entire community at legal and financial risk, likely without your knowledge or consent?" Gerald finally broke. "Karen just said the lawyer was handling it," he blurted out. "She said it was standard procedure." "It was not standard procedure," I said calmly. "It was an illegal act, and it has exposed every single one of you to massive liability." The room was on the verge of open revolt. People were shouting questions at the board, demanding answers. Karen banged her gavel, a small, pathetic sound in the growing chaos. "This is not the proper forum," she shrieked. "Mr. Thorne is in violation. He is the one breaking the rules." Bob, the Air Force veteran, stood up. "What about my basketball hoop, Karen? Was that breaking the rules, or was it just not to your taste? You cost me $600 in fines for that." "Mrs. Henderson stood up, her voice trembling but strong. "And our tree? A 20-year-old maple. You made us cut it down because you didn't like it. You threatened us with a lien, too." One by one, the other homeowners I had spoken with stood up and told their stories. The forbidden gnome, the too blue door, the flagpole. The room listened, rapt, as the pattern of abuse became undeniable. This was never about the rules. It was about control. It was about one woman's ego. The final blow came from an unexpected source. A woman in the back stood up. "I'm on the board of the Oak Hollow Garden Club," she announced. "We had a presentation last month from the owners of the 3 biggest nurseries in town. They told us that their entire spring and summer inventory of specialty plants depends on Mr. Thorne's greenhouse. They said if it goes, their businesses will be devastated, and we won't have any of the plants we look forward to every year." The room fell silent again, processing this new information. I wasn't just a homeowner, I was a vital community asset, and Karen, in her blind quest for power, had tried to destroy it. She looked around the room, her face ashen. She saw no allies. Her board was staring at her with betrayal in their eyes. Her neighbors were looking at her with contempt. Her husband wasn't there to back her up. She was alone, exposed, and utterly defeated. The HOA's lawyer, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, stood up and cleared his throat. "In light of the information presented here tonight," he said carefully, And to mitigate further financial and legal exposure to the association, I am advising the board to table all pending violation matters and to enter into immediate mediation. It was over. He had thrown in the towel. Karen stared at him aghast. She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. She had lost her army, her legal counsel, and her authority, all in the space of one evening. She slumped back in her chair, a queen dethroned in her own throne room. The emergency board meeting was held 2 days later. I wasn't there, but Eleanor gave me a detailed, play-by-play account. The 4 other board members, faced with an impending lawsuit and a full-blown community rebellion, had finally found their courage. They confronted Karen, armed with the knowledge of her unilateral actions and the potential financial ruin she had brought upon them all. The HOA's lawyer was present, and his advice was stark and unequivocal. Karen Miller was a liability the HOA could no longer afford. They had 2 choices: ask for her resignation or face a protracted and likely losing legal battle that would bankrupt the association and make them all personally liable for damages. Faced with that ultimatum, even Karen's monumental ego had to bow. She resigned, effective immediately. The board, in its first act without her, voted unanimously to rescind all fines against me, Bob, the Hendersons, and the half-dozen other families caught in her web. They issued a formal, written apology, drafted by their lawyer, acknowledging the procedural errors and misinterpretations of covenants. It was a dry, legalistic apology, but it was a victory nonetheless. The illegal lien on my property was withdrawn the next day, the paperwork sent to my lawyer with a speed that spoke of pure panic. With Karen's resignation and the rescinding of all actions against me, Alex and I agreed to hold off on filing our lawsuit. The goal was never to make money. It was to correct an injustice. We had achieved that. We kept the threat in our back pocket, a permanent deterrent against any future HOA overreach. The news of Karen's downfall spread through Serenity Meadows like a cleansing fire. There was a palpable sense of relief, as if a great weight had been lifted from the community. People started talking to their neighbors again. Bob put his basketball hoop back up. The Hendersons started planting a new garden where their maple tree had been. The reign of terror was over. A special election was held to fill the vacant board positions. To my surprise, a delegation of neighbors, led by Eleanor and Bob, came to my door and asked me to run. I politely declined. I'm a grower, not a governor, I told them with a smile, but I'll be happy to advise. Instead, Bob ran for president and Eleanor for the head of a newly reformed architectural review committee, this time with a full 5-person membership and a new charter based on common sense rather than cosmetic tyranny. They won in a landslide. The weeks that followed were a quiet joy. My first major shipment of orchids to the Gilded Trowel was a massive success. Martha was thrilled, and the payment that landed in my business account was a tangible symbol of my victory. I was free to work, to build my business, to live my life without the constant threat of bureaucratic warfare. I spent my days in the warm, humid air of the greenhouse, the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers, a constant reminder of what I had been fighting for. Sarah and I could finally relax, enjoying the peace of the property we had worked so hard to build. One Saturday morning, a few months after the annual meeting, I was in the greenhouse, carefully pollinating a rare Cattleya variant. The door slid open and Bob walked in, not as a fellow insurgent, but as the new HOA president. He looked around, a genuine smile on his face. "Wow, Marcus," he said, his voice filled with awe. "So this is the unapproved temporary structure. It's incredible." "Thanks, Bob," I said, shaking his hand. "Welcome to my office." He wasn't there for an inspection. He had brought a peace offering, a bottle of good bourbon and 2 glasses. We sat on a couple of overturned buckets among the orchids and tomatoes, and he told me about the changes they were making. They were rewriting the most ambiguous and punitive sections of the covenants, simplifying the rules and focusing on major issues like safety and infrastructure, not the color of someone's front door. "We found the books, by the way," Bob said, his voice dropping. Karen was using the HOA credit card for all sorts of personal expenses. Dinners, trips to the salon, you name it. The board is deciding whether to press charges. I just shook my head. The overreach, the entitlement, it ran deeper than any of us knew. Her downfall was total and complete, a self-immolation fueled by her own arrogance. We sat there for a while, sipping bourbon and talking about the future of the neighborhood. It felt like a community again. As he left, he paused at the door. You know, you taught us all a lesson, Marcus. Not just how to fight City Hall, but that you have to. If you let bullies take an inch, they'll take everything. I thought about that after he was gone. He was right. I hadn't wanted this fight. I just wanted to grow my plants. But Karen had forced the issue. She had picked a fight with a man who had spent his entire career understanding rules, structures, and systems. She brought a clipboard to a logistical war. She thought the rules were her weapon, but she never bothered to read them properly. She saw a gardener. She didn't see a strategist. In the end, I didn't win because I was stronger or louder. I won because I was more patient, more meticulous, and because my cause was just. I looked at the rows of thriving plants around me, each one a testament to that principle. The greenhouse stood, not as a symbol of defiance, but as a symbol of quiet, resilient, and well-planned victory. The war was over, and the peace was beautiful.